Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
And Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
All right, guys, we are super excited today to let you know that we have an interview with Mr. Doug Perry. You guys know him. You remember he was featured heavily in our 2-episode focus on the true crime behind the musical Chicago. And so as we teased last season, he is here with us today to talk about the follow-up book. So welcome to Doug. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here on your show.
Well, we wanted to start simply by asking a little bit about your background. Could you tell us a bit about how you got into writing and what your background is?
I've enjoyed writing for as long as I can remember, since I was a little kid. I'd come home from school, 4th grade, 5th grade, and go straight in my room and write stories. My mom told me once she figured out that she needed to just let me have my alone time right after school. And after about an hour or so, I'd come out and be ready to talk to her, tell her about my day, have a snack,
Yeah.
So I've always liked to write, but I never formally studied it in school beyond basic English classes. I majored in history and political science. So I never took a creative writing class, never taken a journalism class, though I've been a journalist for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
I learned writing by doing and by reading, better or worse.
I'm really identifying with you right now because that's fairly well my experience too. I just do it. I do by experience, not by, having done it before.
Was it your interest in history that led you to the project of the Girls of Murder City, or what did lead to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was living in Chicago in the 90s. And I've always loved history as well. And, Chicago has such a wonderful history. And the way I got to know the city when I moved there right after college is on the weekends. I just jumped on the L and I would get off at a different L stop every time and just walk around the neighborhoods.
Wow.
And, just the buildings and just everything. It's just amazing, what history is just right there in front of you. And then I try to find out about it. But actually, with Girls of Murder City, kind of started for me during a visit to New York. I saw the musical Chicago shortly after the revival opened on Broadway. And I noticed in the playbill just a 1-sentence mention that the original play that the musical was based on, was based on Maureen Watkins's, the playwright's, experiences as a Chicago crime reporter in the 1920s. Considering that I was a journalist in Chicago at the time and the salacious, violent subject matter of the musical, I wanted to find out more about the real story. Went to bookstores, went to the library, and I was surprised that there just wasn't much more out there. Not much had been written about Maureen Watkins or the murders that inspired the play. So I decided to find out myself, started to do my own research, and I realized there's a book here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Have you gotten to read Maureen Watkins' original play? Did you find it to read it?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's available.
Where can we find it? Because I was interested in reading that too.
Go on to Amazon.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, that would.
Yeah, it was republished in the late 90s. It is amazing how little was written about it over the years. I had to rely on documents that I had to dig out, that no one had looked at in decades and that, hadn't been digitized and probably never will be digitized because there's no real point. And it's costly. At one point, I convinced a staffer at the Cook County clerk's office to let me go through stacks of mostly unorganized 100-year-old divorce records.
Oh my gosh.
And somehow I stumbled upon the files for Belva Gardner, one of the murderesses of Cook County Jail.
Uh-huh.
And it was glorious, such a wonderful find. They did legal documents differently back then. These divorce records, they told her story and the story of her marriage in plain language about the subject's backgrounds and attitudes, about their extramarital affairs and the private eyes they'd hired and the arguments they'd had. It was just an incredible find. And the same went for police trial records. These records included complete verbatim interrogation interviews
Wow.
and court testimony. And again, this stuff was just packed away in storage rooms, boxes, undisturbed for decades.
What a find.
Yeah, so I started to feel like I had personally interviewed some of the men and women in the book.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we loved your book so much, which I'm sure you could tell. But not only did we find out so much more about true crime aspects, as you've just said, but Maureen was such an unknown to us.
I want to pay you a compliment, because one of the things I loved about that book and the next book that we're going to talk about is how you just told it like it was, just like what you were saying about those records you read. You just laid it all out there and said, here's what these people were like, the truth about what they were like, and however you feel about them is up to you, but I'm going to give you the facts. And I just loved that method of writing. I loved it.
Oh, thank you very much. Absolutely. That's what the historian is supposed to do.
Yeah, but you do it so well.
Thank you. That means a lot to me to hear.
Well, okay, let's move on to your next book, which is what followed up Murder City, which was Eliot Ness, The Rise and Fall of an American Hero. So why'd you choose that to be the follow-up to The Girls of Murder City?
Oh, when you're researching any topic involving Chicago in the 1920s,
Right.
of course, you have to delve into Prohibition and how
Right.
it changed the city and changed how people thought about the rule of law and the world around them. You also have to dig into Al Capone. And that inevitably brought me to Eliot Ness. Like with the real story of Cook County's so-called Mary murderesses, I wanted to know more about Ness. And again, I found very little. Almost everything out there that we knew about Ness ultimately came from one source, and that was Oscar Frehley's book, The Untouchables. And it was widely known that The Untouchables, the book, was highly fictionalized. I wanted to find out if Frehley's Ness was the real Ness. Back to dusty old documents in Chicago and in Cleveland, where Ness later worked. And I discovered that in some fundamental ways, the Eliot Ness and Frehley's book was accurate, but in many more ways, it was wrong. Frehley created, a Superman. Eliot Ness, he was courageous and he was a decent man, but he was human with the faults and frailties that all of us have. He definitely was a hero, but he was also a tragic figure.
Yeah. To me, reading it, I'm not sure. I'm still trying to formulate what I feel about Eliot, because I finished the book fairly recently, and it seems like Eliot lived in a very black and white reality. For him, everything was black or white. It's either good or bad, but he himself was such a shades of gray character. He had so many good qualities and so many qualities that just were horrible. But that's humans, I guess. He just was a fully complex human being that did a lot of good, and I mean, I don't want to say he did bad. He didn't do bad, but he treated people badly. His wives, mostly.
Yeah, he struggled with insecurity throughout his life. And later alcoholism. I think he loved each of his wives very much, but he was driven to have affairs, and I think that again speaks to his insecurities. And he was, as much as he loved his wives, he loved his job more. That's where he found his validation, and he needed that. He needed that badly, and so he ultimately neglected his wives in favor of the job.
Moving on to our next question here. In the beginning of your book, Eliot is described as something of an annoying do-gooder. At least in my opinion, he was. So, for example, here's an excerpt. He fit all the do-gooder stereotypes. He still lived at home. He took his meals there and called his mother every day to let her know if he'd be late. He wore the same 2 suits over and over. As a junior agent, he earned $2,500 per year, which was enough for him. That was the problem. He couldn't find a friend in the office. No one wanted anything to do with him. What do you think about Eliot's upbringing or personality caused him to fit this kind of do-gooder stereotype? And why do you think it was so off-putting to others, at least early in his career, when for Maureen, in your last book, her being good was actually very appealing to those who worked with her? Is it just different expectations for men versus women in that age, or what do you think about that?
Kind of a big question there. Yeah, Alexander Jamie
Yeah.
was
Yeah, his
Eliot's brother-in-law. He was 20 years older than
Uh-huh.
Eliot. He was a very influential figure in Eliot's life, really a father figure. Jamie was an FBI agent and later a Prohibition agent. And Eliot wanted to be just like him. And Jamie was a self-righteous do-gooder.
Yeah.
He told young Eliot, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil."
Yes.
Eliot wanted to live up to Jamie's standard. He wasn't always good, but he never called evil good. He didn't rationalize and fool himself. He tended to think the worst of himself and wanted to be better. Now, the reason Eliot's Prohibition Bureau colleagues early on wanted nothing to do with him is that a large majority of agents, especially in the Chicago office, were on the take.
That's right.
Oh, that's
They
right.
made paltry salaries while everyone around them during the Roaring '20s seemed to be getting rich and living large. And the mob was willing to pay bribes and offer all sorts of other inducements. So Eliot's colleagues didn't want him around because they knew he was a straight arrow, that he
Got
wouldn't
it.
take bribes. So it's
Yeah.
like Serpico decades later. This kid would be a problem because he would look askance at what they were doing, and who knows what he might do, who he might tell.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
As for why, Maureen Watkins being good was appealing to her coworkers, because she was a woman and
Right.
a beautiful woman.
Yeah.
Of course she was good. Of course she was better than grubby men. Men idealized her. They wanted to be near her and be cleansed through that proximity. Such were the common attitudes of the era.
Something that was kind of funny is I remember back when we were doing the Murder City episodes, Ashley and I joked about the part where Belva Gardner said she needed to carry a gun because she was so frightened of the gangsters and the violence around her. And we kind of made light of it.
Yeah.
And then reading this book,
I was like, oh my gosh, she's right.
She was absolutely right. Like the Chicago that you described in this Eliot Ness book was terrifying. And so I don't know that our listeners would, depending on their knowledge of history, if they would understand just how bad it was either. So we thought we'd share just this one small excerpt that paints just a tiny picture of what it might have been like, and then ask for more of your thoughts. Here's what it said. Capone, the big fella, or number one to his men, Scarface Al to the press, sought to lock down his new standing and expand his domain in the only way he knew how, through terror. In 1926, 76 hoodlums were killed in Chicago as rival gangs fought it out over turf and hurt feelings. Many of these killings happened in public, in drive-by machine gun attacks. That meant civilians were falling too, including an assistant state's attorney, William McSwiggan. Anyone walking in the loop began to flinch or outright panic whenever they heard an automobile sliding around the corner at a decent clip. So what other insights would you add about just how frightening the scene was in Chicago at this time, and the task that Eliot faced in trying to get this under control?
Yeah, Chicago was the Wild West.
No kidding.
And you now had, automatic weapons, machine guns, all these mobsters had. And yeah, there was just a huge amount of money to be made in bootlegging.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a lot of people who stepped up during Prohibition to take advantage, and to, you had one, they became so wealthy. You had one mobster who had a solid gold toilet in his home.
Wow.
It was just, so with that kind of money on offer, a lot of people are willing to do some pretty awful things. So a lot of the violence was, gangster on gangster, but it spilled over. And so, yeah, if you were walking in the downtown loop and you heard a car careening around the corner, it wasn't just someone trying to get through an intersection. At least it
Yeah.
might not be. And you knew you better dive for cover just in case.
Yeah.
People were scared, and they knew that the mob had bought much of the police force and many judges, and so they knew there was no justice to be found. On the one hand, Prohibition was very unpopular, and so people romanticized Al Capone and other gangsters. But it got to a point where people were scared enough that they wanted things to change, and that's where Eliot got his opportunity.
Do you think that they were romanticizing Capone because of the war and just they felt like life is short and he kind of presented himself as this Robin Hood character at first? Do you think they were buying that, or what was the reason for romanticizing this man who is murdering people?
World War One absolutely helps explain the changing values and mores in the 1920s. Then you add in Prohibition, which shows that if government passes laws that most people really don't like and feel are unjust, the rule of law loses legitimacy and civil order breaks down. So someone like Al Capone in that circumstance can become a hero. Among many groups, alcohol had deep cultural and even religious meaning. You couldn't just wipe that away by passing a law. Right. Now, prohibitionists, being fanatical, couldn't see beyond the stereotypical wastrel drunkard. So they didn't foresee the wholesale rejection of prohibition by millions of Americans, high and low. The old saw applies: be careful what you wish for.
You just might get it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't think anyone anticipated just how powerful the gangs would become because of bootlegging and how much money there would be in bootlegging. And part of the hero worship is also just Capone had a high profile, and, celebrity has always been attractive. He was in the newspapers,
Right.
headlines on the front pages every day.
Yeah, just like the girls, Belva and Sheila, they were heroes.
Right, people are impressed. Yeah.
Well, okay, so we talked earlier about how I don't want to say nobody liked Eliot, but the do-gooder attitude kind of was off-putting to people. So then after he starts his work in Chicago as a prohibition agent, the tide kind of starts turning. You quoted in the book Francis Mulvaney, is that how you say his name? Mulvaney?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you quoted Francis Mulvaney as saying, Ness worked hard, took every risk he asked his men to take. He was honest and likable. My father respected him. So do we think that Eliot's winning people over with his work ethic and willingness to risk his life? Or what do you think is changing opinion? How is he helping to change opinion about himself?
Eliot did not become a prohibition agent because he believed in prohibition.
Right.
He took the job because he wanted to get into law enforcement, and that's where his brother-in-law could get him hired.
Right.
Eliot vigorously and honestly undertook his duties because he was ambitious, but also because he truly believed in law and order. He saw that the mob didn't stop with selling booze. He recognized that illegal booze led to murderous violence, and that it financed other underworld activities like prostitution, and that it corrupted every level of government. He believed deeply in good government. He was a committed goo-goo, as government reformers were called in the first half of the 20th century. Leaders lead by example, whether a good example or a bad one. That stuff travels, Eliot would say. By the mid-1920s, as I said, the Prohibition Bureau was so corrupt, so brazen and over the top about it, that a backlash happened. And Eliot was a part of that. First as a rookie agent working for George Golding, who was brought in from New York to clean up the ranks and really truly take on the mob rather than just pretending to do so.
Right.
Golding flamed out by being too trigger happy. His men, not Eliot, kept accidentally shooting innocent people.
You can't do that.
Yeah, and Golding was rather flip about it. Hey, that's the price of doing business. You want to take on the mob, people are gonna
die.
Yeah, so
turns out citizens frown on that.
Yeah. So Golding was sent packing after a relatively short time in Chicago. But the U.S. Attorney, George E.Q. Johnson, he recognized that the Chicago Bureau still needed a Capone squad.
Mm-hmm.
And Eliot, he was only in his late 20s. He got the job almost by default. No one really wanted it. You know, it was kind of viewed as a death wish. You know, people were afraid of the mob, including the police. So if you were going to really take on the mob rather than just pretending to take on the mob, bad things were probably going to happen to you. Johnson saw something in Eliot, which is interesting because, again, Eliot was in his late 20s. He hadn't really accomplished much. And a lot of people underestimated Eliot early in his career. He
Probably
was
because of that baby face, right?
Yeah, exactly. He was boyish looking. He had this sweet smile. You know, he was, thin. He wasn't, this big strapping guy. He looked harmless.
Yeah.
And it took people a long while, whether Johnson in Chicago or Neil McGill in Cleveland, who was a assistant Cuyahoga County prosecutor, to believe that Eliot really was going to do the things that he said he was going to do, which was take on police corruption, take on the mob. And it took these people even longer, of course, to realize he had what it took to pull it off.
That he meant what he was saying.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a really quick question. I don't even remember if we wrote it down here, but there was one part where you talked about when he would question people, the widow, for example, the first widow that he got to turn on the mob, and he used that sincerity. And I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think you said it bordered on ridiculous. Like if he had just pushed a little bit harder, it would have been ridiculous how sincere and earnest he was. Do you think that was really him, or had he just tapped into his own persona and he knew that by doing this he could get her to flip on the mob? What do you think about that?
Oh, I think it was real. I think that's who he was. At the same time, I mean, any interview, whether it's a reporter or a federal investigator, it's a performance. You want a specific result, and so you are thinking about how to gain that result. But yes, he was. Old women and dogs loved him. I mean, that was just. He was the kind of guy that a mother would want their daughter to bring home. Kevin Costner played him in the movie, but Jimmy Stewart would have been a great choice earlier to play him. He had that kind of persona in his, and that was his natural persona.
You mentioned Kevin Costner playing him in the movie. I'm going to confess that I was very uninformed. I actually had to find a movie that starred Robert Stack. I think it was The Return of the Untouchables, because I'd never seen his TV series, which apparently ran from 1959 to 1963, called The Untouchables. And then, of course, the 1987 film that you referenced that starred Kevin Costner was the same name. But this is how many Americans, I think, came up with their image of what Eliot Ness is like. Right. So we've just said he actually did have a lot of heroic qualities, a lot of very admirable qualities. So what do you think kind of separates the real Eliot Ness from this Hollywood version?
Eliot would not have recognized himself either of those portrayals. Maybe a little bit in Costner's. Not at all in Stack's. As we were just discussing, Eliot's secret sauce was that he didn't fit the part of the fearless, larger-than-life gangbuster.
Right.
He came across as an ordinary guy, amiable, harmless. There was a fun story in a Cleveland newspaper at the height of Eliot's fame in that city, capturing a scene from a trial with gangsters in attendance in the courtroom. When Eliot enters the room, suddenly their swagger goes away and they're nervous and they're darting eyes following Eliot walk around the room. This young guy who looked like a government clerk at best. But at the same time, his deeds spoke. And I was kind of flipping through the book here in preparation for this, and one thing kind of jumped out at me here, where he's in Cleveland as a new safety director, mid-30s, and you don't have TV, you don't have the internet, obviously, so it's not like he's world famous for his work, with the Untouchables. And so, he goes in and talks to the county prosecutor and the assistant prosecutor McGill, who I mentioned, about actually taking on police corruption. That you can't beat the mob if you don't first get rid of police corruption.
That's right.
And the prosecutor, I mean, this is shocking to the prosecutor that would even be considered. You can't take out police corruption because everyone's involved in it, including all the politicians. And he's like befuddled that Eliot is posing this and asking for their backing. And the prosecutor says, well, where do you start? And so Eliot says, at the logical place. We start at the source.
Right.
This thing called vice and corruption is a many-headed serpent. We're going to start by lopping off those heads one at a time and let the chips fall where they may. Both of you know as well as I do that crime cannot flourish in any city without protection, police protection. And I have reason to believe that the crooks and gangsters are getting plenty of it in Cleveland. So we start with the police.
Right.
So that was a quote that McGill was remembering a few years later and talking about how shocked he was that this was actually going to happen. That this young guy, the new safety director of Cleveland, was going to try to make this happen.
I think for me, it was interesting because, again, I had to educate myself a little bit. But when I was watching the two films that I just referenced, my thought was they tried to make Eliot Ness appear perfect in every way. It was even stylized in the Robert Stack version. Like you'd have the music in the background and it was just so over the top. Like we're going to show this person as just, I feel like he was supposed to be the perfect father, like he just seemed like he was just really, as you said, larger than life. Whereas the Eliot that I saw in your book was single-minded and would show bravery and fearlessness and courage. And he showed character in the way that he would put his life on the line and he would be right in the thick of it with his men. So I saw so many admirable qualities, but I did not in any way see perfection. I saw humanism. Right. I think to me, that was a big difference. But this was just, again, I'm speaking from a place where I'm not nearly as well informed, just kind of some impressions that I had.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Eliot struggled with self-worth.
Yes.
Hard to say why. I mean, some people are just built that way.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, he was overcompensating to try to prove himself to himself, really more than anyone else. And it worked for many years until it didn't. But his personal life certainly suffered. He was such a likable guy. Everyone said so, and charismatic. But he had difficulty, as so many people do, particularly men, expressing his feelings. And so I think he had difficulty with intimacy. So he was, I think he was lonely for much of his life, and he couldn't. I think he struggled with depression of some sort. And that's why he started to drink to excess. So he was a complicated, individual.
One of the things I thought was interesting is how he was described as a giggler several times in the book. And that does not fit what you think of Eliot Ness being as somebody that liked to giggle or play practical jokes or any of that kind of stuff. That did not fit with your preconceived notion of him.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, you mentioned Cleveland, so let's move on to Cleveland and talk about what he did there, because this is a part, I think I'm speaking for Candy too, where I'm going to say I was more impressed with what he did in Cleveland than even the Al Capone section of the book. And I do think it was funny though, in the Al Capone section, you said that first night when he broke into one of those buildings that he'd been chasing the high ever since then. So that first night of, I don't know, axe grinding or whatever, he'd been chasing that forever. But he moves on to Cleveland. He becomes the safety director, the public safety director, and his top 3 priorities were to first clean out corruption in the police department, then modernize the police department, then attack the mob. And he insists on hiring a group of secret investigators to help him with this work, seeing as the only way to find out who the corrupt policemen were, kind of like what he did with the Untouchables. This time they're called the Unknowns. So what do I guess us as a collective here, all of us, think that his work in Cleveland did to help solidify his standing as an American hero? What do you think contributed to it, and what do you guys think surprised you about his work?
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize Cleveland back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s was one of the biggest, most dynamic cities in the country. Or before the industrial decline of the following decades that have cut its population in half.
I was really impressed by how important Cleveland was to America. Right.
Yeah. The mob problem and the police corruption in Cleveland was arguably just as bad as it was in Chicago. So first off, Eliot went in there to clean up the corrupt police force, as we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Using his own off the books secret investigators. And that was a brilliant idea, I think. No one had ever done anything like that before. And it worked. I mean, who could he trust in the police force? No one, because it was so from the top to bottom, rife with corruption. Everyone was on the take to one degree or another. So he had to bring in officers who no one in the force knew.
Yeah.
That only he knew about. And that took, a year. I mean, we also don't realize today, we expect from arrest to trial to conviction that's going to take many years. Mm-hmm. Not back then. Back then, you'd arrest someone, they would go on trial like 3 weeks later. The trial would take a week. Yeah, so things moved faster back then. So yes. He got within a year a couple dozen major convictions of police officers. So he cleaned it up pretty quickly. And once that was done, he took on the mob there, which ran illegal gambling, prostitution. Bootlegging continued because liquor taxes post-Prohibition were quite high. And he all but destroyed the Cleveland mob. He gained quite a few convictions of mob bosses who were shocked by this because they thought they owned the town. They had owned the town for the past couple decades. Mm-hmm. These were astonishing successes that, even without the Untouchables, qualify him as one of the great lawmen of American history. And he wasn't just a guy who sat behind a desk. He was out there on stakeouts, kicking down doors, doing undercover work. And that still isn't all. He was also an innovator. In many ways, he invented the modern police force.
I know. That's what's so impressive. Me. Yeah. It was so impressive. I was blown away. I was very, very impressed with him.
That's what I found most surprising because, Doug just described very beautifully all these things that he did that I think would seem like impossible tasks.
Yeah.
But your point about in the meantime, he innovated and brought in all these new methods and techniques that were more up to date and more effective for the police department and the law enforcement. Like that totally shocked me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a student of the criminologist August Vollmer.
Yeah.
And Vollmer never got to put most of his ideas into practice. He was briefly the police chief in Los Angeles, but got run out of town. So he spent most of his career as an academic. So it fell to Ness to put Vollmer's ideas into practice as well as his own ideas. He was facing severe budget cuts in Cleveland. This was during the Depression. So he felt like he had to experiment fearlessly. And he ultimately showed Los Angeles and New York and other cities how things should be done. He was absolutely the foremost proponent of what was then called scientific policing. He was into ballistics and
lie detector.
Lie detectors. He was a big proponent of lie detectors and, fingerprints, which was becoming something that was used more and more. Things like footprints, matching, the soles of shoes. All of this was before the FBI lab existed, and there was a great resistance in police circles to this stuff. They thought it was ridiculous. Just as, the old timers thought that, formalized officer training was ridiculous. Ness started a police academy in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Before that, a new officer, and this was the case in most cities at that time, they'd be given a badge and a gun and sent out into the street with no training.
Good luck.
He was supposed to learn by doing, by watching his partner, who hopefully was a veteran. So, all of this was completely changing the police department. And in fact, another way is that he recruited from colleges. Police had always been, like newspaper reporters, a working class profession. Mm-hmm. He went to local colleges and started trying to get them students to come and apply to be police officers.
Very impressive.
He believed that police officers needed to do what is essentially social work.
Yes.
Oh,
yes. With the juveniles.
Yes.
Yeah. He believed in crime prevention. And again, that was a radical idea in the 1930s. It's pro forma police work today and has been for decades, but not back then. Critics accused him of being soft on crime. Police officers were supposed to arrest people and smack them around so they might think twice about committing more crimes. And that was it. Crime prevention ideas were for utopians, not serious men. He had to overcome a lot of criticism and pushback on that. And yeah, as you said, he tried to keep juveniles, teenagers, out of the criminal justice system, if at all possible.
Yeah,
He created a jobs program, which was run by the safety department, working with Cleveland's major industries to give jobs to troubled teens. He worked to lessen the problems of alcoholism and homelessness, again, areas of concern that traditionally were far outside the purview of a law enforcement official. This is remarkable stuff that people don't realize about Eliot Ness.
It really is. I'm glad you brought that up because
Yes.
there's so many things that we think we just take for granted of, oh, of course this is the way the police system works. And a lot of it sounds like it came from Eliot, who got it from, I'm assuming, got a lot of it from his Volmer. Do you think he just kind of acted from his gut and said this just makes the most sense? Where do you think he got
It's a combination. Yeah, I mean, certainly Volmer had thought a lot about this stuff and had studied it, and Ness took a lot of that and theoretical backing and put it into practice. And then you come up with new ideas as you start to put things into practice and realize you got to tweak this or try that. So it was a combination.
One of the things that you mentioned that I actually really identified with Eliot was his melancholy, where he had periods of intense productivity followed by melancholy and feelings of inadequacy. For me, it's almost like a cycle. I feel like I ride that wheel all the time. I'll be intensely productive for days or weeks, and then I'll go into the just depths of emotional despair, thinking, what am I doing with my life? And, facing the void that is the future. And then a few days later, I'll be fine. So I don't really have a question for it other than to say that's what I identified with him the most, is seeming to act from his gut. His ideas that he had for the police, he did it because, well, it just makes sense. And a lot of the things I approach, I do the same way. Well, this just makes sense. I don't really have a reason for it. Just why don't we try it this way? And maybe Eliot maybe he was an introverted. He was if you do the Myers-Briggs, maybe he was an INFJ, or he had these periods of creativity but also insecurity. I don't know, but anyway, like I said, it's not really a question, it's just a commentary on that's the part that I really felt like I get it, Eliot. I don't know why it is this way, but I really get it.
Yeah, he was introverted, and he forced himself to be social and outgoing, and I'm sure that contributed to his alcoholism. People who are introverted, socially awkward, they go to a party, they need a few drinks to loosen up and feel comfortable around other people.
Well, for me, I need the person at the party to have an animal so I can go pet it. And
Exactly.
I
Yes.
don't have to interact with the people at the party.
Right.
A good cat, let me go play with your cat.
Yeah, Eliot had emotional highs and lows throughout his life. He may have had imposter syndrome.
Oh, for sure. I think for sure, because I definitely have that every day of my life. Yes. I would give you a solid yes that he has imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Even when he was locally famous in Cleveland,
right,
with his name splashed across the front page of headlines almost every day, he was humble. He didn't think he was special. Here's a story I love that I posted. It's in the book. When Cleveland's mayor, Harold Burton, told Eliot over the phone that he wanted him to take on, the huge job of cleaning up the corrupt police department, wanted him to be safety director, and Eliot accepted, didn't even ask the salary, just say, yep, I want that job. The mayor told him to come right over. So Eliot, he was working, for the federal government in another downtown Cleveland building. He walks over to City Hall. Now, this was the beginning of Burton's administration. And back then, it was expected, when you had a new mayor, for people to go to the mayor's office and ask for a job. And this is, the Great Depression. So there's desperation out there. And so mostly, these are people asking for small-time jobs, like a toll collector. So Eliot comes into the large outer office, the mayor's suites, and it's absolutely packed with job seekers. Eliot has just been hired for the most important job in the city after that of the mayor. and the mayor has asked him to come right over. So you think Eliot would push through this crowd and tell the secretary who he was and go right back to see the mayor.
Mm-hmm.
Nope. He stood in the back and he waited his turn. After about a half hour or so, when he hadn't shown up, Burton figured Eliot got caught up at his, current job as a federal agent. And so he told an aide, go out and get him. The aide goes out and he finds him standing there in the back of the outer office, just patiently waiting his turn.
Yeah.
That to me that's Eliot Ness.
Yeah.
Do you think, we've said he was insecure, he may have had imposter syndrome, he was humble, he was always trying to prove himself. Was part of it trying to prove himself to his dad? Do you think there were some underlying issues of wanting approval from male role models? Or I don't know. It just occurred to me.
Yeah, probably. Certainly he wanted Alexander Jamie's approval. He doesn't appear that he was close to his father. He was very close with his mother.
He never
His
did mention
father.
his dad died, I think, right?
His father died, when he was still, on the way up in Eliot's professional career. I think he was still married to his first wife, Edna. Eliot was a straight arrow professionally, like Jamie. He'd never take a bribe, but he wasn't a judgmental man. Early on with the Untouchables, when he found out that a couple of his men were taking bribes, he didn't immediately fire them.
Mm-hmm.
He understood that everyone had weaknesses. He had them himself. He wanted results, and that was his guiding light. He needed people who were suspect to get those results. He would work with them. So I don't know. He didn't care what people said about him when he believed he was right in what he was doing.
Mm.
But at the same time, he was insecure and he needed to be bucked up and encouraged.
Mm-hmm. He had so many ironies. He just had so many complexities in him. He's a fascinating figure. So the official title of your book is Eliot Ness, The Rise and Fall of an American Hero. So we've been talking about the rise. Let's talk about the fall a little bit. He went from stratospheric heights of popularity in 1936 to 19 years later dying in near obscurity, which was one of the most astonishing things to me. In your opinion, Doug, what do you think this says about fame in general, or Eliot more specifically?
It says that times change fast.
Yeah.
The stock market crash in 1929 upended the world in a snap.
Mm-hmm.
And then Pearl Harbor in 1941 did the same.
Mm-hmm.
If Eliot had run for mayor of Cleveland in 1941, as many people encouraged him to do,
Yeah.
he'd have won in a walk, a rout. He was that popular. But when he ran just 6 years later,
Yeah.
everything was different.
Yeah.
His pre-World War II heyday as safety director seemed like it was 1,000 years ago. He wasn't the boy wonder anymore. At the same time, his alcoholism was beginning to show.
Yeah.
And so he just wasn't sharp like he used to be. He was very articulate, just such a go-getter, so much energy. That's what he was known for. And I think it was probably a shock to many Clevelanders when they saw him out on the campaign trail in 1947, where he was just kind of a little bloated, just, a step slow, just didn't seem entirely engaged in what was going on around him. That's what any addiction can do to you. It had gripped him by then, and so led to a sad final decade for him.
It did. To me, it was so sad that essentially alcohol is what led to his rise because he was getting rid of it, purging the city of it. But then alcohol also led to his fall because he was intaking it. It just was another one of those ironies of Eliot, that alcohol was responsible for both parts of his life, the rise and the fall. To me, anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Armchair psychologist.
Well, we typically end our show with an armchair psychologist question. And so we would love to bring you into our armchair part, if you don't mind, Doug. You had a quote in your book that said, we didn't have the mass communication and mass transportation that exists nowadays. We didn't have as much schooling either. As a result, people were more unique then, more unusual, more different from each other. Now, people are all more or less alike, company men, security-minded like-minded, conformity, that sort of stuff. Because your book really pushed us to think about this idea of heroism and what it takes to really be a hero, we thought we'd put that quote in front of us and consider that idea. Do we think it still applies in our society today? Do we center around conformity and like-mindedness? And if that is the case, then what does it take to be a hero in today's world? You know, who would you be writing about? Who would be written about 100 years from now as a true hero?
Yeah, good question. There was a survey or something that came out, I don't know, a year or so back, asking teenagers what ideally would be what would they do when they grew up? What would be their profession, be their ideal profession?
Mm-hmm.
And the winner was social media influencer.
Wow.
Yeah, not president, not astronaut,
Mm-hmm.
not scientists, social media influencer. So our concept of what makes a hero isn't what it used to be.
Yeah.
Right.
TV started that degradation of what was an accomplishment, and the internet has accelerated that. So, we even kind of, forget that movie stars as people to look up to is a relatively new phenomenon.
Yeah, within the last 100 years, really.
Less than that, I would say. It reminds me of one of my favorite movies. My favorite year. Have you ever seen that?
Yes, I'm not an actor. I'm a movie star.
Exactly. So there's this one scene where Peter O'Toole, as the movie star Alan Swan, he's drunk and he wants to get into this party to help his friend, the writer, connect with the writer's girlfriend. And so he tries to rappel down the side of a building to swing into, the open courtyard, there. And he misses and goes over the railing. And these two toffs, city elite guys are, having their drinks, and one of them looks over the railing and he says to the other, hey, I think Alan Swan is beneath us. And his friend says, of course he's beneath us. He's an actor. And that was how well-to-do, accomplished people thought of actors.
Yes.
For years, up until really, I'd say the 60s, when that started to really change, and they became actors were started to become people you looked up to. Hero status is very different in today's world than it was in the 20s and 30s and 40s when Eliot Ness was a young man and working.
Yes.
I love your answer, because you've made me think about, I think it all comes back to how we define a hero, because I think in the past, when we would try to pin down our definition of a hero, it was somebody who would put others above themselves, somebody who would sacrifice to do something good for whether it was a group of people or society in general, but they were about others. Whereas I think you've made me realize a lot of times now the word hero just means famous or celebrity or well-known, versus these qualities that we might actually admire in a person.
Right.
Exactly. You're a hero for accomplishing big things. That's why when you think of heroes pre-late 20th century, it was always leaders, generals, sometimes CEOs, and then not until really the middle part of the 20th century, you start to see athletes, you start to see movie stars, and now social influencers, so it's a different world.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what current projects are you working on now, or what's next for you? And how can our listeners follow you or access your work?
I don't have a book project at the moment. I am a senior writer and reporter for the Oregonian newspaper here in Portland.
Oh.
Right now, what I'm working on, last year, I published a 4-part investigative piece about a 1989 murder across the river here in Vancouver, Washington. And the woman who was murdered, Effie Intezari, her estranged husband was quickly convicted, but their daughter, Pune, doesn't believe her father was guilty. And she has dedicated her life, really the past 30 years, to investigating the case and trying to find the real killer. who she thinks really killed her mother. And she's had incredible success, and she's been patient, waiting for advances in DNA technology and ballistics. So I wrote about that, and now it looks like, with just a little bit of luck here, that's going to become a multi-part documentary.
Oh, fantastic!
So I'm hoping that comes together, and we shall wait and see. But that's been a really fascinating project to work on. I spent a year on, and it looks like it might not be over.
Wow, that sounds fascinating and so worthwhile. I mean, if this will all pay off and hopefully, bring some justice to this situation.
That will be nice. I think fingers crossed things might happen here in the next month or so to move this case along even more.
Amazing. Thank you so much for talking to us. This has been absolutely fascinating. And it's funny because I just realized when we started, in my mind, I had you kind of labeled as, Doug Perry, this very well-known, accomplished journalist and author. And now I am definitely thinking of you as those two things, but also historian, because your historical knowledge is just so impressive. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And we just really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking to both of you. I enjoy your podcast, and keep it up.
Thanks so much. If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page, or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.